The chamber went cold the moment I stopped smiling. I did not raise my voice, I did not stand, I did not even move my hands, which the other delegates had learned to watch, because humans talk with their hands as much as their mouths. I simply let the smile fall from my face, and every creature in that circular hall of glass and light seemed to lean back at once, as if I had pulled a knife from beneath the table. My name is Cale Renard, and 3 years ago, I became the first human ever allowed to sit on the Galactic Concordance Council. I was given a chair between a species of crystal-skinned philosophers and a species of six-legged traders, in a room built for beings who had been meeting like this for over 4,000 years. Humanity had been part of the wider galaxy for less than 2 decades. We were the newest, the smallest, the most fragile voice in that entire hall. And for 3 years, I smiled. I smiled when the Vren delegate, a tall insect-like being named Sozren, made jokes about how humans laughed at everything, even danger. I smiled when the crystalline Thokoth spoke slowly to me, as if I were a child who needed simple words. I smiled when my own colony's rights were questioned, when our history was called short, when our species was called new and untested and, more than once, harmless. They had a name for me in the private channels I was not supposed to know about. They called me the Smiling Ape. It was not said with hatred, it was said with the same gentle amusement you might use for a puppy that wags its tail no matter how it is treated. I let them believe it, because letting them believe it had kept the peace, and because for 3 years I had nothing else to give them but patience. That day, the patience ran out. It started, as most disasters do, with something that sounded small. The council session had gone on for 6 hours already, moving through disputes between older species over trade routes and mining rights in systems I had never heard of. I sat through most of it in silence, taking notes, learning the rhythms of a body that had existed since before my ancestors learned to write. Then the session moderator, a floating orb of light called an Osu emissary, spoke a name I knew very well: Kepler's Reach. I sat up straighter. Kepler's Reach was not a name on a map to me. It was a place with a name I had heard since childhood, a colony built by people who had left Earth with nothing but hope and enough supplies to survive the first winter. It was where my cousin lived. It was where 3 generations of a family named Ellery had built a farm out of red dust and stubbornness. It was where 200 children went to a school built from the metal of the ship that brought their grandparents there. The Osu emissary explained, in its calm and drifting voice, that a dispute had arisen. The Vren claimed an ancient mining right to the outer belt of that system, a right recorded in concordance law long before humanity had even discovered fire, let alone spaceflight. Because of this ancient claim, the council was considering a reallocation. The word they used was gentle, reallocation, as if moving a filing cabinet, as if not moving 200 children and their families and everything they had built with their own hands. I asked, as politely as I could manage, what reallocation meant in practical terms. The Osu emissary answered without any weight in its voice at all. It meant the colony would need to relocate. It meant the land, the farms, the graves of the first colonists who had died taming that world would become Vren territory. It meant humanity's claim, built over 3 generations of blood and sweat, meant nothing next to a piece of ancient paperwork. I smiled. Of course I smiled. It was the only tool I had ever needed in that room. I asked for time. I said I would need to consult my government before responding to such a significant proposal. The council granted me 72 hours, the way you might grant a child extra time to finish homework you already expect them to fail. Sozren, the Vren delegate, leaned toward me as the session ended, his mandibles clicking in what I now knew was his species' version of a smile. He said it was nothing personal. He said his people had claimed that belt long before mine had learned to walk upright. He said humans were sensible creatures, agreeable creatures, and he was certain I would see reason. I smiled back at him and said I would think about it carefully. What I did not say was that I already knew every name in that colony's founding record. What I did not say was that my own grandmother had helped design the water reclamation systems that let those first colonists survive their first year. What I did not say was that reallocation was not a word my people used lightly, because we had spent our entire history being reallocated, pushed, and told our claims did not matter, long before we ever left our own planet. I walked out of that chamber with my usual easy expression, nodding at delegates I passed in the long crystal corridor that connected the council hall to the diplomatic quarters. A Thokoth elder paused to compliment my patience, the way an adult might praise a child for sitting quietly during a long ceremony. I thanked her and kept walking, my footsteps steady on floors older than my entire civilization. Only when I reached my private quarters and the door sealed behind me did I let my expression change. I sat down at the small desk built into the wall, meant for a species half my size, and I opened a secure channel back to Earth. It took 11 seconds for the signal to bounce through the relay stations, 11 seconds that felt far longer. I did not send a long message. I did not explain everything that had happened in that chamber. The casual cruelty wrapped in polite language, the ease with which an ancient civilization decided to erase a human home because an old law said they could. I sent a single line. They are taking the reach. Send me the file. I did not wait for a reply. I knew it would take time to arrive, and I knew that whatever answer came back would change how the next few days unfolded. For now, I sat alone in a room built by beings who had never once had to fight for a scrap of land they called their own, and I let myself feel, for just a moment, the full weight of what I had smiled through all afternoon. Outside my window, if it could be called a window, since it was really a curved viewing panel built into the wall of a station orbiting a star that was not my own, I could see the slow turn of stars I had not grown up beneath. Somewhere out there, invisible from this distance, was a small red world with a school, built from an old ship's hull, and 200 children who had no idea their home was being discussed as a line item in an ancient dispute over mining rights. I thought of the Ellery family, 3 generations deep in that soil. I thought of my cousin, who had sent me a message just last month, showing me photos of the first real harvest their farm had produced, without needing supplement shipments from Earth. I thought of the small stone markers at the edge of the settlement, each one carved by hand, each one a name of someone who had died making that ground livable so their children would not have to. None of that mattered to the council, not yet. I understood, sitting there in that quiet room, that I had spent 3 years building a reputation as the delegate who never grew angry, who always smiled, who could be trusted to accept whatever compromise the older species offered, because humans, it seemed, valued peace over pride. That reputation had served a purpose. It had kept the door open for humanity at a table we had barely earned a seat at. It had let us learn, watch, and grow without drawing too much attention to how much we were learning. But reputations, I realized, can become cages if you let them. I thought about Sazran's words in the corridor. Nothing personal, he had said. His people had claimed that belt long before mine had learned to walk upright. It was true, in the strictest sense. The Vren civilization was ancient beyond anything my species could claim. Their written laws predated my planet's oldest cities. By every measure that the concordance used to settle disputes, their claim was stronger. But laws written by the powerful, for the powerful, rarely account for what happens when someone new arrives at the table and refuses to simply accept the terms as given. I only knew that smiling through this particular loss was not something I could bring myself to do, not when it meant erasing a home that real people had built with their own hands, not when it meant treating human lives as a line to be redrawn on a map that had never once considered us worth protecting. I spent that first night reviewing everything I could find about the Concordance's founding charter, the ancient document that governed every dispute, every claim, every ruling made in that glass chamber. It was thousands of pages long, written across several different alphabets, some of which had been translated into human language only in the last decade since our arrival on the galactic stage. Most of it was procedural. Most of it existed to protect the interests of species who had already claimed their place among the stars, long before humanity had even imagined such a thing was possible. Buried within it, though, in a section rarely referenced because it was rarely useful to anyone with real power, was a clause about precedent, A newer species could challenge an ancient claim if it could demonstrate a pattern of survival and rebuilding equal to or greater than the claim being defended. It was an obscure clause, written centuries ago as a courtesy to species who might one day rise from nothing, never expected to actually be invoked, because no species young enough to need it had ever been strong enough to use it. I read that clause 3 times before I understood what it meant. Humanity had a pattern of survival unlike almost anything documented among the older civilizations at that table. We had clawed our way back from disasters that should have ended us as a species entirely. We had rebuilt cities from ash more times than most of these ancient beings had rebuilt anything at all, because most of them had never needed to. Their civilizations had grown slowly, steadily, without the violent interruptions that had shaped every chapter of human history. I did not know yet if that pattern would be enough to save Kepler's reach. I did not know if the Council would even allow such an old and unused clause to be raised by a species they still considered new and untested. But for the first time since I had sat down in that chamber 3 years ago, I understood that my seat at that table might be worth more than I had allowed myself to believe. The message from Earth arrived just before dawn, according to the station's artificial cycle. It was not a simple reply. It was an entire archive, compressed and encrypted, larger than any single file I had ever received through official channels. The header on the file was short. It read only 2 words: precedent, human. I stared at that file for a long moment before opening it, some instinct telling me that once I read what was inside, the easy version of myself, the smiling ambassador who had spent 3 years disarming every insult with a laugh, would not return in quite the same way. I opened it anyway. The first thing that loaded onto my screen was not data or law or diplomatic language. It was a single image, an old photograph scanned from some forgotten archive on Earth, showing a city reduced to rubble and dust, with a handful of survivors standing among the ruins, looking not defeated but simply exhausted, the way people look when they have already decided they will rebuild before the ash has even settled. Beneath the image was a single line of text, written by whoever on Earth had compiled this file for me. They already knew what we would do next. We always do. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting that sink in, before I began to read the rest of what my own people had sent across the stars to remind me exactly who I represented in that glass chamber full of ancient, careful, powerful beings who had never once had to learn what it truly meant to survive. Whatever came next, I understood that the smiling ambassador they had grown used to seeing was about to change, and I was not entirely certain, in that quiet hour before the station's artificial dawn, whether the Council was ready for what that change would bring. Kepler's reach was not chosen by accident. Nothing about it was accidental. Not the location, not the people who first stepped onto its red soil, not the years of quiet, grinding work that turned a barren rock into something worth calling home. I remembered the stories my grandmother used to tell me, back when I was small enough to sit on her lap and ask endless questions about the stars. She had been part of the second wave of colonists, arriving 4 years after the first ships landed, when the settlement was still little more than pressurized domes and a handful of stubborn engineers trying to convince a hostile atmosphere to support human life. She told me about the dust storms that lasted for weeks, thick enough to blot out the weak sunlight entirely, forcing everyone into the underground shelters they had carved by hand because the automated drilling equipment had failed within the first year. She told me about rationing water so carefully that children learned to bathe in cups rather than basins, and how nobody complained because complaining did not fix broken filtration systems. She told me about the graves. There were 14 of them at first, marked with simple stones because the colony had no resources to spare on anything more elaborate. 14 people who had died trying to make that world livable before anyone else arrived. An engineer named Daniel Okafor, who died repairing a hull breach during the worst storm of that first winter. A botanist named Laura Whitfield, who spent 3 years trying to coax edible plants from soil that fought her every step of the way, and succeeded just months before an equipment failure took her life. A teacher named Peter Callahan, who taught the first generation of colony children how to read, using books printed on paper, because their electronic archives had been damaged during transit. By the time I was old enough to visit the colony myself, those 14 graves had grown into a proper memorial garden, tended by volunteers, visited by every new arrival as part of an unofficial tradition. You did not become a true citizen of Kepler's Reach until you had walked that garden and learned every name carved into its stones. My cousin Elena Ellery lived there now, along with her husband and their 2 children. She had sent me messages over the years describing the slow transformation of that world, how the domes had given way to proper structures built from local materials, how the once barren fields now produced enough food not only to sustain the colony but to trade with passing ships, how the school that once used a handful of salvaged textbooks now had its own printing press and a small but growing library. 200 children attended that school now. 200 futures built on the foundation laid by 14 graves and 3 generations of relentless work. And the council wanted to call it reallocation, as if it were nothing more than shifting supplies between warehouses. I spent the morning after receiving that archive from Earth, reviewing every piece of data it contained, cross-referencing it against the Concordance's ancient charter, searching for exactly how the precedent clause had been used before, if it had ever been used at all. What I found surprised me. In over 4,000 years of recorded Concordance history, that clause had been invoked only 3 times, and each time by a species already established enough to have significant political weight behind their claim. It had never once been invoked by a species as young as humanity, a species that had been part of the wider galaxy for less than 2 decades. I understood why. Raising that clause required more than just legal standing. It required proof, extensive and verifiable, that a species had faced destruction on a scale equal to or greater than the civilization whose claim they were challenging, and had rebuilt from that destruction not once but repeatedly, demonstrating a pattern rather than a single fortunate recovery. The file from Earth contained exactly that kind of proof, compiled by historians and diplomats who had clearly anticipated that someday some human representative sitting in that glass chamber would need it. I read through summaries of civilizations that had risen and fallen across human history, cities built and destroyed and rebuilt, populations reduced by disease and conflict to fractions of their former numbers, only to recover and grow stronger within a handful of generations. I read about entire societies that had been pushed to the edge of collapse by disasters both natural and self-inflicted, and had clawed their way back each time with a stubbornness that seemed almost irrational when compared to the slow, steady growth patterns of species like the Vren or the Thokath. The Vren, I learned from cross-referencing their own submitted historical records within Concordance archives, had experienced nothing resembling true civilizational collapse in over 6,000 years. Their society had grown gradually, carefully, protected by natural advantages and a biology that made large-scale conflict between their own people exceedingly rare. They had never needed to rebuild from nothing because they had never lost everything in the first place. That was not a criticism of them. It simply meant they had no true understanding of what it meant to lose everything and choose to build again anyway. Humanity understood that completely. We had built that understanding into our bones across thousands of years, long before we ever looked up at the stars and wondered what might be waiting for us there. I began drafting my response to the council that afternoon, though I knew I would need every remaining hour of the 72-hour recess to prepare it properly. I could not simply walk into that chamber and demand they honor an obscure legal clause. I needed to present it in a way that left no room for dismissal, no room for the kind of gentle condescension that had followed me through every prior session. As I worked, a message arrived from Sozren, the Vren delegate, requesting a private meeting before the formal session resumed. I considered declining, but curiosity and a small measure of strategic thinking convinced me to accept. We met in a small chamber just off the main diplomatic corridor, a room designed for quiet conversations away from the formality of the full council. Sozren arrived without any of his usual aides, which told me he wanted this conversation to remain unofficial. He began, as he often did, with something meant to sound friendly. He said he hoped I understood that his people held no ill will toward humanity. He said the claim to that mining belt had existed within Vren records for centuries before humans had even developed the technology to leave their own solar system, and that honoring ancient claims was simply how the Concordance maintained order among its many member species. I listened without interrupting, letting him finish before I responded. I told him I understood the claim existed within his records. I told him I did not dispute the age of that claim. What I disputed was the assumption, built into how his people and so many others on that council viewed humanity, that an older claim automatically outweighed a living, breathing community that had spent 3 generations building an actual home on that world. Sazran's mandibles clicked in what I now recognized as mild surprise. He said he had not expected such a direct response from me, given how I had conducted myself throughout my time on the council thus far. I told him that patience was not the same as weakness, and that he would do well to remember the difference before our next session. He studied me for a long moment, his multifaceted eyes reflecting the soft light of the chamber, before he spoke again, more carefully this time. He asked what exactly I intended to argue when the council reconvened. I did not give him a direct answer. I told him only that his people should prepare to have their claim examined more closely than they had anticipated, and that the outcome might not be as simple as a routine reallocation. He left that meeting without his usual easy confidence, and I understood that word of our conversation would likely spread through the diplomatic corridors before the formal session even began. That was fine. I wanted the other delegates uncertain. I wanted them to wonder, for the first time in 3 years, what exactly the smiling human delegate might do when pushed too far. That evening, I contacted Elena directly, using a personal channel rather than an official diplomatic line. I did not want to alarm her with details of council politics she had no reason to worry about, but I needed to hear her voice, needed to remind myself exactly why this fight mattered beyond legal precedent and political strategy. She answered from her kitchen, the familiar sounds of her household in the background, her youngest child laughing somewhere off screen. She asked how life among the stars was treating me, half joking, half genuinely curious about a world so different from the one she called home. I asked her, carefully, if she had heard anything about disputes concerning the colony's territory. She said no, nothing beyond the usual bureaucratic notices that occasionally arrived from Earth's diplomatic office, nothing that had ever seemed urgent or significant. She asked if something was wrong. I told her not to worry, that I was simply doing my job as her representative among the stars, and that I would make certain nothing happened to the home she and her family had built. She smiled, the easy, trusting smile of someone who had no idea how close her entire world had come to being redrawn on a map by beings who had never once set foot on its red soil. After the call ended, I sat alone in my quarters for a long while, thinking about the 14 names in that memorial garden, about 200 children who deserved to grow up in the home their families had built, about a civilization of insectoid traders who genuinely believed an old law entitled them to erase all of it without a second thought. I thought about the smile I had worn for 3 years and how it had served its purpose, opening doors that might otherwise have remained closed to a species still finding its footing among far older neighbors. I thought about how that same smile, if I wore it into tomorrow's session, would be read as acceptance, as surrender, as confirmation that humanity would indeed prove as agreeable as Sazran and so many others expected. I understood, sitting there in that quiet room, that tomorrow would require something different from me, not anger, not aggression, but a clarity and firmness that the council had never once seen from their smiling human delegate. I did not sleep well that night, but for the first time since receiving news of the dispute, I did not feel powerless either. I had the archive from Earth, a legal clause buried deep within ancient concordance law, and a growing understanding that the very thing the other delegates had mistaken for weakness might be the exact tool I needed to protect the home my family had built with their own hands. The next morning, I did not smile when I entered the diplomatic corridor. I nodded politely to the delegates I passed, spoke when spoken to, but the easy warmth I had worn like armor for 3 years remained absent from my expression. A Thokoth elder who had complimented my patience just days earlier gave me a curious glance as I passed, as if noticing, for the first time, that something about the smiling human delegate had changed. I did not explain myself to her. I simply continued toward the council chamber, the compressed archive from Earth secured within my personal data drive, the precedent clause memorized word for word, and a quiet resolve settling over me that felt entirely unfamiliar after 3 years of careful, practiced agreeableness. Whatever happened in that chamber today, I understood that the version of myself who had smiled through every insult and every slight was not the version who would be walking through those doors. But before I reached those doors, I paused in the corridor, and something in me needed a few more hours before facing that room again. I returned instead to my quarters, sealed the door, and opened the full archive from Earth one more time, determined to understand not just the legal argument I would make, but the truth underneath it, the truth I had somehow never fully sat with, despite having lived it my entire life. I began with the oldest records, entries compiled from historians who had spent decades gathering evidence of humanity's long and difficult relationship with disaster. The file did not read like a legal document. It read like a confession, an honest accounting of every terrible thing that had ever happened to my species, laid out without excuse or embellishment. There were entries about plagues that had swept through entire regions of Earth, reducing populations by staggering fractions within a single generation, leaving behind grieving survivors who somehow, against every reasonable expectation, rebuilt their communities within a handful of decades rather than surrendering to despair. There were entries about conflicts so devastating that entire cities had been reduced to little more than scorched earth, only to be rebuilt, sometimes larger and more resilient than before, by the children and grandchildren of those who had lived through the destruction. There were entries about periods of history when it seemed as though humanity might simply end, undone by its own worst instincts, by resource scarcity, by conflicts between nations, by disasters both natural and self-inflicted, and yet, every single time, without exception, humanity had found a way forward, not easily, not without staggering cost, but always, eventually, forward. I read about early human ancestors who had survived climate shifts so severe that entire populations had been reduced to numbers small enough to fit within a single modern stadium, a genetic bottleneck so narrow that some researchers believed our species had come within a hair's breadth of complete extinction tens of thousands of years before recorded history even began. And yet here we were, spread across star systems, sitting at a table with civilizations that had never once faced anything close to that kind of existential threat. I thought about what that meant, sitting alone in my quarters, with the weight of that history settling over me like something physical. Every species on that council had grown up in relative safety, protected by circumstances of biology or geography or simple good fortune that had spared them the kind of repeated, brutal winnowing that had shaped humanity across our entire history. They had never needed to develop the particular kind of stubborn, unreasonable hope that allowed a species to look at complete devastation and decide, without any guarantee of success, to rebuild anyway. That stubbornness, I realized, was not a flaw to be smiled away in diplomatic meetings. It was the single most defining trait of my entire species, buried so deep in our collective behavior that even our smiles, the very thing the council had mistaken for weakness, were actually a symptom of it. I thought back to every joke Sozrin had made about human laughter, every comment from Thokoth delegates about how humans smiled, even in moments of tension or disagreement. They had read that as evidence of simplicity, of a species too emotionally shallow to understand the gravity of the situations it found itself in. They had never considered the alternative explanation, the one that made far more sense once you understood the history behind it. Humans smiled because smiling, laughing, finding some small piece of lightness even in terrible circumstances was how we had survived circumstances that should have broken us completely. It was not weakness. It was armor forged across thousands of years of practice, a coping mechanism so deeply embedded in our behavior that we rarely even recognized it as a survival strategy anymore. We smiled at funerals. We joked in hospital waiting rooms. We laughed in the middle of disasters, not because we did not understand the severity of what was happening, but because that laughter was often the only thing standing between us and complete collapse. The Council had mistaken our oldest, most battle-tested survival tool for evidence that we posed no threat at all. I found myself thinking about every predator species throughout Earth's own natural history that had made a similar mistake, underestimating early humans because we lacked claws sharp enough or strength great enough to seem dangerous by any conventional measure. Those predators had not accounted for tool use, for cooperation across large groups, for a species willing to plan and wait and adapt in ways that raw physical strength could never match. Most of those predator species no longer existed. Humanity, against every reasonable expectation given our physical limitations, still did. I wondered if the Council was making the same mistake, judging humanity by outward appearances, by manners and expressions and surface-level behavior, without ever considering what lay beneath it. I continued reading through the archive for hours, moving through century after century of recorded human history, watching the same pattern repeat itself again and again, with almost mechanical consistency. Devastation, grief, a period of apparent hopelessness. And then, without fail, rebuilding, often stronger and more capable than before the devastation had occurred. Near the end of the archive, I found something I had not expected, a section clearly added more recently than the rest, containing personal accounts rather than historical summaries. These were testimonies from colonists across various human settlements throughout the galaxy, people who had left Earth to build new lives on worlds that had no interest in making that process easy. I found an entry from a woman named Grace Ashworth, one of the original colonists on a settlement 3 systems away from Kepler's reach, describing the first years of building a home on a world with an atmosphere that had nearly killed half her original expedition team before proper adaptations could be developed. She described losing friends, losing equipment, losing nearly everything they had brought with them from Earth, and choosing every single day to continue anyway, because turning back was never truly an option once you had committed yourself to building something new. I found an entry from a man named Nathan Pierce, describing his experience on a mining colony that had suffered a catastrophic equipment failure during his second year there, killing a third of the colony's population and leaving the remaining survivors without adequate life support for nearly 6 months, while replacement parts made the long journey from the nearest supply depot. He described how the survivors had rationed everything, working together in ways that strangers rarely worked together, in order to keep the colony alive until help arrived. He described how, rather than abandoning the colony after such a devastating loss, the survivors had chosen to stay, had chosen to finish what those who had died had started. I found an entry describing the earliest days of Kepler's reach itself, written by someone whose name I recognized immediately, because it was the same name carved into one of those 14 memorial stones. Laura Whitfield had kept a journal during her time on the colony, and excerpts from that journal had somehow made their way into this archive, preserved by historians who understood that her words carried weight far beyond simple record-keeping. She wrote about the difficulty of coaxing life from soil that seemed determined to resist every effort at cultivation. She wrote about failed harvest after failed harvest, about the growing fear among the colonists that they had made a terrible mistake in choosing this particular world, about nights spent wondering if they would need to abandon everything and return to Earth in defeat. And then, in an entry dated just months before her death, she wrote about the first successful harvest, small and imperfect but real, proof that the soil could be tamed with enough patience and enough stubborn refusal to give up. She wrote that she finally understood, watching that small harvest come in, that this world would eventually become home, not because it had been easy, but because she and everyone around her had simply refused to accept any other outcome. I sat with that entry for a long while, feeling something shift within me, a clarity settling over the anger and frustration I had been carrying since the Council first mentioned reallocating that world as if it were nothing more than an inconvenient line on a map. This was what the Council did not understand, what they could not understand, because their own history had never demanded this kind of stubborn, repeated defiance against circumstances that should have ended them. They saw a young species, new to the galaxy, easily amused, quick to smile, and they assumed that surface simplicity told them everything they needed to know about our capabilities and our resolve. They had never once considered that the smile itself was the result of surviving things that would have permanently changed or ended almost any other species they had ever encountered. I closed the archive and sat quietly for a long moment, watching the artificial light of my quarters flicker slightly as the station made its slow adjustments to accommodate the different day cycles of its many resident species. I thought about the 14 graves in that memorial garden, about Laura Whitfield's small imperfect harvest, about Daniel Okafor repairing a hull breach in the middle of a storm that should have killed him long before he finished the job, about Peter Callahan teaching children to read using books printed on salvaged paper because giving up on education was never something his generation considered, even in the depths of their hardest years. I thought about my grandmother, telling me these stories as a child, never once dramatizing them, simply stating them as fact, as the ordinary and expected behavior of people determined to build a life worth living, regardless of the obstacles placed in front of them. I understood, finally and completely, what I needed to do when I returned to that chamber. I was not going to argue for Kepler's reach as a matter of sentiment, though sentiment was certainly present in every fiber of my resolve. I was not going to plead for mercy or ask the council to consider the human cost of their decision, because mercy was not something an ancient legal system built around precedent and property claims typically extended to those it considered lesser. Instead, I was going to remind them, clearly and without apology, exactly what kind of species they had allowed to sit at their table. I was going to show them that the smile they had mistaken for submission was, in fact, the direct product of a species that had already survived worse than anything the Concordance could threaten us with, and had done so not once, but across thousands of years and countless separate disasters, each one different, each one nearly fatal, and each one ultimately overcome through nothing more than stubborn refusal to accept defeat as a final answer. I gathered the archive files onto a single secured drive, along with the specific citation for the precedent clause buried deep within the ancient Concordance Charter, and I prepared myself, mentally and emotionally, for a conversation unlike any I had held in that glass chamber during my 3 years as humanity's representative among the stars. I thought, briefly, about Sazrin's earlier confidence, about his assumption that I would eventually see reason and accept his people's ancient claim as simply the natural order of things. I thought about how genuinely surprised he had seemed during our private meeting, when I had refused to offer him the easy agreement he had clearly expected from the smiling human delegate. He had no idea what was coming. None of them did. I checked the time. The formal session would resume within the hour. I gathered my materials, straightened my posture, and walked toward the door of my quarters, feeling a strange calm settle over me, the kind of calm that came not from confidence in an easy victory, but from clarity about exactly what needed to be said and exactly why it mattered. As I stepped into the corridor, a young aide from the OSU delegation passed me, offering the polite greeting customary among council staff. I returned the greeting with a nod, my expression steady and unreadable, nothing like the easy warmth that had defined every previous interaction throughout my time on this station. The aide paused for just a moment, something shifting in the subtle bioluminescent patterns along its floating form, a reaction I recognized from studying OSU communication patterns during my early diplomatic training. It was the reaction of a being sensing something unfamiliar, something that did not match the established pattern it had come to expect. I continued walking without acknowledging the reaction further, my thoughts already moving ahead to the chamber, to the delegates who would soon witness a version of the human ambassador they had never once encountered, to the argument I had spent the past 2 days preparing with a thoroughness born not from anger alone, but from a deep and settled understanding of exactly who my people were and exactly what we had already survived to reach this point. By the time I reached the entrance to the council chamber, the familiar doors sliding open to admit me into that vast circular hall of glass and light, I understood completely that whatever happened in the next few hours would change how every species on that council viewed humanity from that moment forward. I stepped inside without a smile on my face, and I did not intend to let one return until this matter had been settled entirely on terms that honored everything my people had already survived to earn their place at that table. The chamber was already filling with delegates when I entered, the low hum of conversation in a dozen different languages washing over me as I made my way to my designated seat. Sozrin was already there, along with several members of his delegation, and I noticed him watching me carefully as I crossed the room, his multifaceted eyes tracking my expression the way a predator might track something unfamiliar in its territory. The Osu emissary that served as session moderator arrived last, its glowing form settling into position above the central speaking platform. It called the session to order with its usual calm, drifting voice, listing the matters scheduled for discussion, with the Kepler's Reach dispute positioned near the top of the agenda. I did not wait to be called upon. As soon as the emissary finished its introduction, I requested immediate recognition to address the matter directly, a request that drew a few curious glances from delegates who had grown accustomed to my more measured, patient approach to council proceedings. The emissary granted my request, and I rose from my seat, feeling the weight of dozens of unfamiliar eyes settling on me at once. I began speaking before any hesitation could creep into my voice. I told the council that I had spent the past 2 days reviewing every relevant piece of concordance law related to territorial claims and dispute resolution, and that I had found something worth bringing to their immediate attention. I explained the precedent clause, reading its exact wording aloud so there could be no confusion about its meaning or its legitimacy within their own ancient charter. A newer species could challenge an established claim if it could demonstrate a documented pattern of survival and rebuilding equal to or greater than the civilization defending that claim. I watched several delegates exchange glances as I finished reading the clause, clearly surprised that such an obscure and rarely used piece of their own law had been raised at all, let alone by the newest and, in their estimation, least significant member of their council. Sozrin spoke first, his tone carrying the same easy confidence he had shown during our private meeting, though I noted a slight edge to his voice that had not been there before. He acknowledged that the clause did technically exist within concordance law, but questioned whether a species as young as humanity could possibly meet the burden of proof required to invoke it meaningfully against a claim as ancient and well documented as his own people's mining rights. I told him I had anticipated that exact question, and that I had brought the necessary documentation with me. I activated the display embedded within the speaking platform, projecting a summary of the archive Earth had compiled, careful to present it not as an emotional appeal, but as a straightforward accounting of documented historical fact. I walked the council through century after century of human history, describing devastating losses that had reduced populations to fractions of their former size, and the consistent, repeated pattern of rebuilding that had followed each of those losses without exception. I explained the genetic evidence of a population bottleneck so severe that some researchers believed humanity had come within a small margin of complete extinction tens of thousands of years before recorded history had even begun, and how the species had not only survived that bottleneck but had gone on to build civilizations across an entire planet within a relatively short span of time afterward. I described plagues, conflicts, and disasters that had each individually been severe enough to end many civilizations permanently, and how humanity had instead rebuilt from each one, sometimes stronger and more capable than before the devastation had occurred. The chamber grew quieter as I spoke, the usual background murmur of side conversations fading as delegates began paying closer attention to the pattern I was laying out before them, a pattern that none of them, I suspected, had ever fully considered when forming their casual assumptions about humanity's supposed simplicity. I then turned my attention specifically to Kepler's Reach itself, describing its founding, the 14 colonists who had died during its first difficult years, the memorial garden that had grown from those original graves, the the school built from salvaged materials that now served 200 children whose families had spent 3 full generations transforming a barren, hostile world into a genuine home. I told the council that this pattern, small in scale compared to the broader sweep of human history, was nonetheless the same pattern repeated at every level of our civilization, from individual colonies to entire planets. We did not simply occupy territory. We built homes from nothing, we lost people in the process, and we honored those losses by continuing anyway, refusing to abandon what had already cost so much to create. I paused, letting that statement settle over the chamber before continuing. I told them that I understood the Vren claim to that mining belt predated humanity's arrival among the stars by centuries, and that I did not dispute the historical accuracy of that claim. But I reminded the council that their own ancient charter, the very document governing this dispute, explicitly allowed for circumstances where a demonstrated pattern of survival and rebuilding could outweigh the simple age of a competing claim. I told them that humanity's pattern, documented across thousands of years and dozens of near-catastrophic events, more than met that standard, and that dismissing our claim to Kepler's reach in favor of an unused ancient mining right would represent exactly the kind of failure of judgment the precedent clause had been written to prevent. Sozrin rose to respond, his composure visibly strained now, his mandibles clicking rapidly in a pattern I recognized as agitation rather than his usual amusement. He argued that historical hardship, however severe, did not automatically translate into a stronger territorial claim, and that allowing such reasoning to stand would set a dangerous precedent that could destabilize property rights across the entire concordance. I responded calmly, without raising my voice, telling him that I was not asking the council to establish a new precedent. I was asking them to honor an existing one, written into their own charter, long before humanity had ever been discovered, precisely because the authors of that charter had understood that survival and resilience mattered as much as simple chronological priority when determining rightful claims to contested territory. I watched the Thokoth elder who had once complimented my patience shift uncomfortably in her seat, her crystalline form catching the light in ways that suggested genuine unease rather than her usual serene composure. I noticed the Osu emissary's glowing form pulsing with a slightly different rhythm than it had displayed at the start of the session, a subtle shift that I recognized, from months of careful study, as the Osu equivalent of alarm. I understood, watching these reactions ripple through the chamber, that something had shifted in how the council perceived me, and by extension, how they perceived all of humanity. I decided, in that moment, to press the point further, not through threats or aggression, but through simple, unadorned truth. I told the council that I had spent 3 years sitting at that table, smiling through every joke made at humanity's expense, every casual assumption that our species was simple, harmless, easily managed. I told them that I understood why they had reached that conclusion, given how readily and consistently my people smiled and laughed, even in circumstances that seemed to warrant far more serious reactions. I told them, however, that this smile had never been a sign of weakness or simplicity. It was, instead, the direct result of a species that had survived circumstances far worse than anything the Concordance had ever faced collectively, circumstances that would have permanently ended most civilizations represented in that very chamber. I told them that humans had learned, across thousands of years of repeated devastation and recovery, that finding lightness, even in the darkest moments, was not a failure to understand the gravity of a situation. It was, instead, one of the most effective tools our species had ever developed for enduring exactly that kind of gravity without breaking under its weight. I told them that mistaking our smile for weakness was the same mistake made by every predator species throughout our own planet's history that had underestimated us because we lacked obvious physical advantages, and that most of those predator species no longer existed, while humanity, against every reasonable expectation, still did. The chamber had gone completely silent by this point, every delegate's attention fixed entirely on me, none of the usual side conversations or casual dismissiveness that had characterized so many previous sessions. I told the council one final thing, delivered as calmly and clearly as everything that had preceded it. I told them that Earth had, in recent months, quietly shared this same historical archive with several other younger member species currently navigating their own disputes with older, more established civilizations within the concordance. I told them that these younger species had begun independently reviewing their own histories, searching for similar patterns of survival and resilience that might allow them to challenge claims they had previously accepted without question. I watched the reaction to this statement ripple through the chamber more forcefully than anything I had said before, a visible tension settling over delegates who had built their entire political standing on the assumption that younger species would remain grateful, agreeable, and unlikely to challenge the established order that had governed the concordance for thousands of years. I did not threaten violence. I did not raise my voice or make any gesture that could be interpreted as aggression. I simply stated, plainly, that the era of younger species accepting ancient claims without question, purely out of deference to age and tradition, might be coming to an end, and that humanity's presence at this table had already begun accelerating that shift. The Osu emissary's glowing form pulsed erratically for several long seconds before it finally spoke, its voice carrying a slight tremor that I had never once heard during my 3 years observing its usual calm, measured moderation of council proceedings. It asked for a brief recess to allow the council to consider the precedent I had raised and the documentation I had provided in support of it. I agreed, and as the session paused, I remained standing at my place, watching the chamber slowly empty as delegates retreated into smaller private discussions, their usual composure visibly shaken. Sozrin lingered longer than most, studying me with an expression I could not fully interpret, though the earlier amusement I had grown accustomed to seeing in his mannerisms had entirely disappeared. When he finally spoke, his voice carried none of its previous confidence. He asked, quietly, whether I had always been capable of this, or whether something specific had changed within me over these past 2 days. I told him that nothing had changed within me at all. I told him that everything I had just described had always been true, that the pattern of survival and resilience I had laid out before the council had shaped my species since long before we had ever imagined creatures like his might exist among the stars. I told him that the only thing that had changed was his willingness, and the willingness of the entire council, to finally see it clearly. He did not respond immediately. He simply studied me for a long moment before turning and walking away, his usual confident stride noticeably absent from his movements. I remained in the chamber a while longer, alone with my thoughts, watching the empty seats where dozens of ancient, powerful delegates had sat just minutes earlier, their composure shaken by nothing more than a simple accounting of history and a calm refusal to accept dismissal without challenge. I thought about Kepler's reach, about Elena and her children, about the 14 names carved into that memorial garden, and I understood that whatever happened next, something fundamental had already shifted in how this council viewed my species, a shift that would likely echo far beyond this single dispute over a small mining belt on the edge of an unremarkable star system. The recess lasted far longer than the usual brief pause between sessions. I spent those hours back in my quarters, reviewing my notes one final time, though I already knew there was little left to add to the argument I had presented. The rest was now in the council's hands, and no amount of additional preparation on my part would change what they ultimately decided. I used part of that time to record a private message to Elena, careful to keep my tone light and reassuring, though I found it harder than usual to summon the easy warmth that had always come naturally when speaking with family. I told her that everything at the colony would be fine, that whatever bureaucratic matters were being discussed among the stars had already been addressed, and that she should focus on her harvest and her children rather than worry about distant politics she had no reason to fully understand. She thanked me, her voice carrying the same easy trust it always had, completely unaware of how close her entire world had come to being redrawn on a map by beings who had never once considered the weight of what they were casually discussing. When the session finally reconvened, the atmosphere in the chamber felt entirely different from anything I had experienced during my 3 years on the council. The usual casual conversations and side discussions were absent. Delegates took their seats with a quiet, measured formality, several of them glancing in my direction as they settled into place, their expressions carrying none of the easy amusement I had grown so accustomed to seeing whenever I spoke. The OSU emissary opened the session by announcing the Council's decision regarding the Kepler's Reach dispute. Its voice, still carrying a faint trace of the tremor I had noticed earlier, explained that after careful review of the precedent clause and the documentation I had provided, the Council had determined that humanity's demonstrated pattern of survival and rebuilding did indeed meet the threshold required to challenge the Vren claim to that mining belt. The reallocation would not proceed. Kepler's Reach would remain under human jurisdiction, its territorial boundaries fully recognized and protected under concordance law. I felt something loosen in my chest as those words were spoken, a tension I had been carrying since that first casual mention of reallocation finally beginning to release. I did not smile, not yet, though I felt the familiar warmth of relief settling somewhere beneath the careful composure I had maintained throughout the entire proceeding. The emissary continued, noting that the Council would be conducting a broader review of the precedent clause's application going forward, given the significant implications raised by this case, though it did not elaborate further on what that review might ultimately produce. I understood, reading between the careful diplomatic language, that the Council had no intention of admitting they had been wrong to consider erasing an entire human colony over an ancient, unused mining claim. Old and powerful institutions rarely admitted fault so directly. They simply adjusted their behavior quietly and moved forward as though the correction had always been the intended outcome. That was fine. I had not come to that chamber seeking an apology. I had come seeking the safety of a home built by people who deserved to keep it. Sozrin did not speak during the remainder of that session, a silence that felt notably different from his usual confident engagement with council proceedings. When the session finally ended, he approached me briefly in the corridor, his usual easy stride replaced by something more careful, more measured. He told me that his people accepted the council's decision, though he made clear that acceptance did not necessarily mean agreement. He said that he had underestimated humanity, and that he suspected he was not alone among the delegates in having made that particular mistake. I told him that most species who had encountered humanity for the first time made a similar mistake, and that it was not entirely their fault. We gave them very little reason to expect otherwise, at least not until circumstances required something different from us. He asked, with what I recognized now as genuine curiosity rather than his previous condescension, whether I intended to continue behaving this way going forward, or whether the smiling ambassador he had grown accustomed to dealing with would eventually return. I told him that the smile had never actually left. It had simply been set aside for as long as circumstances required, and that it would return exactly when it was needed again, because a species that had survived everything humanity had survived across its long and difficult history understood something important about resilience. You did not abandon lightness and warmth simply because you had proven yourself capable of something more serious when the situation demanded it. You held both capacities within yourself simultaneously, using whichever one circumstances required, without either one canceling out the other. He considered that answer for a long moment before offering something I had never once seen from him during my 3 years on the council. His mandibles shifted into an expression that, after careful study of Vren communication patterns, I recognized as an attempt at something resembling a smile, hesitant and unfamiliar on his features, as though he were testing whether such an expression might be safe to offer someone he had only recently learned to take seriously. I returned the gesture with an easy smile of my own, genuine and unforced, the same expression that had defined my presence on that station for 3 years before this particular dispute had required something different from me. He seemed unsure how to respond to that, offering only a brief nod before continuing down the corridor, leaving me alone with my thoughts in the quiet space between the council chamber and the diplomatic quarters beyond. Over the following days, I noticed subtle shifts in how other delegates interacted with me. The casual jokes about human simplicity that had once been so common in the corridors and private meetings largely disappeared. The gentle condescension I had grown so accustomed to absorbing without complaint gave way to something more careful, more measured, delegates choosing their words with noticeably greater consideration when addressing me directly. I did not take particular satisfaction in this shift, though I understood its practical value for humanity's ongoing standing within the concordance. It was simply the natural result of an ancient institution recalibrating its understanding of a species it had previously underestimated, a recalibration that would likely serve humanity well as we continued establishing our place among civilizations far older and, in many respects, far more powerful than our own. I sent a full report back to Earth detailing the outcome of the dispute, along with my observations regarding the broader implications for humanity's standing within the concordance going forward. I noted that the precedent clause, once obscure and rarely used, had now been successfully invoked, potentially opening a path for other younger species facing similar disputes with older, more established civilizations. I received a response from Earth's diplomatic office within a few days, brief but warm, thanking me for my handling of the situation, and noting that several other younger member species had already begun quietly reaching out through unofficial channels, curious about the archive we had compiled, and interested in conducting similar reviews of their own histories. I found myself smiling as I read that message, genuinely and easily, the first time I had allowed myself that expression since the dispute had first begun. A few weeks later, I received a personal message from Elena, filled with the usual updates about her family and the colony's ongoing progress. She mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that the colony had recently celebrated its largest harvest yet, enough surplus to begin trading more actively with passing ships from other systems. She mentioned that her youngest child had recently visited the memorial garden for the first time, old enough to fully understand its significance, asking questions about the 14 names carved into those original stones, wanting to know the stories behind each one. I told her, in my reply, that those stories mattered more than she likely realized, that they represented something essential about who we were as a people, a pattern of resilience and stubborn hope that had shaped humanity across our entire history, long before any of us had ever imagined leaving Earth to build new lives among distant stars. I did not tell her the full details of what had happened in that council chamber, of how close her home had come to being redrawn on a map by beings who had never once considered the weight of what they were casually discussing. I saw no reason to burden her with that knowledge, now that the matter had been resolved. She had her harvest to manage, her children to raise, her own small piece of humanity's larger story to continue writing, and that was enough. I thought often, in the months that followed, about what that entire experience had taught me about my own species, lessons I had somehow understood intellectually my entire life, without ever fully internalizing them until circumstances forced me to lay them out clearly before an audience of skeptical, ancient beings who had never once needed to learn what true resilience actually required. I thought about the smile that had defined my presence on that council for 3 years, and how completely the other delegates had misunderstood its meaning. They had seen simplicity where there was actually depth. They had seen weakness where there was actually a survival strategy forged across thousands of years of repeated hardship. They had seen a harmless, agreeable species where there was actually a civilization that had already faced and overcome challenges most of them could barely imagine, protected as they had always been by the relative safety of their own steady, uninterrupted historical development. I understood, finally, that the smile itself had never been the problem. The problem had only ever been the assumption that a smile meant there was nothing serious standing behind it. I returned to my usual demeanor within the council chamber not long after the Kepler's-Reach dispute concluded, laughing at Sozran's occasional jokes, engaging warmly with delegates from across the many species represented at that table, offering the same easy patience and good humor that had always come naturally to me. But something had changed in how that warmth was received now, an underlying awareness among the other delegates that this particular smile, however genuine and unforced, was backed by something they had only recently learned to take seriously. I did not mind that shift. If anything, I found it clarifying, both for myself and for humanity's broader standing among the stars. We had never needed to abandon our natural warmth, our tendency toward humor and lightness even in difficult circumstances, in order to be taken seriously by civilizations far older than our own. We simply needed those civilizations to understand, clearly and unmistakably, exactly what stood behind that warmth, whenever circumstances required something more from us. Humanity had not stopped smiling because we had run out of kindness or warmth or good humor. We had simply set that smile aside for exactly as long as necessary to remind an entire council of ancient, powerful civilizations exactly why we had earned our place at their table, despite arriving there far more recently than any of them. And once that reminder had been delivered clearly and completely, we returned to smiling again, because that was simply who we were, a species that had already survived the worst that circumstance could throw at us, time and time again, across thousands of years of history, and had chosen, every single time, to meet that history with warmth and stubborn hope rather than despair. It was not weakness. It had never been weakness. It was the particular, hard-earned calm of a species that had already witnessed the very worst things that could happen to it, and had outlived every single one of them anyway. Sazran approached me again some weeks later, during a quiet moment between formal sessions, his manner noticeably more careful than it had once been, though the underlying friendliness that had always existed beneath his earlier condescension remained intact. He asked if I would be willing to share more of humanity's history with him, curious now in a way he had never been before our confrontation over Kepler's reach. I told him I would be happy to, and I meant it genuinely. Understanding between species, real understanding built on accurate perception rather than convenient assumption, mattered far more to humanity's long-term standing among the stars than any single legal victory ever could. As our conversation continued, he offered that same hesitant, unfamiliar expression again, his mandibles shifting into something that increasingly resembled an actual smile, practiced and refined slightly from his first uncertain attempt weeks earlier. I smiled back at him, easily and without reservation, the same expression that had once been mistaken for weakness by an entire council of ancient, powerful beings who had simply never encountered a species like mine before. They understood now, not everything, not completely, but enough to know that the smile they had once dismissed so casually was never the whole story and would never again be mistaken for one. And somewhere out among the stars, on a small red world with a memorial garden and a growing harvest, and 200 children who had no idea how close their entire world had come to changing forever, life continued exactly as it always had, built patiently and stubbornly by people who understood, without ever needing to be told, that home was worth protecting no matter what ancient laws or powerful councils might one day try to claim otherwise.